To fully appreciate the state of Philadelphia's streets in the modern day, then we're going to have to go way back. Before teenage gangsters and drill rappers made the streets their war zone, back to the very start of this historic city. To understand its unique culture and attitude, and to appreciate the inherent grit that underlines society in Philadelphia. These are a people that are tough and refuse to back down in the face of opposition. There are people who refuse to be told what to do or how to live, and will always fight for their way of life. And this is an attitude that's permeated Philadelphia's society for hundreds of years now. Philadelphia is actually one of the most significant cities when it comes to the history of the United States. After being founded in 1682 by an Englishman, William Penn, an influential member of the Quaker movement, which promoted religious freedom, democracy, and equal human rights in early America, the city would later play a key role as a central gathering spot for the nation's founding fathers during the American Revolution and the following Revolutionary War. And it would host the First Continental Congress in 1774 and the Second Continental Congress starting in 1775, where the 13 colonies would plot their get back against the British tyrants. You see, Philly has actually been sliding against the British from day one, and they would elect one of the most respected OGs from their bloc, George Washington, as the commander of their Continental Army. During the Second Continental Congress, the Philly native Benjamin Franklin was also given the task to pen the draft of the first official diss on paper against the Brits. You see, Philly's been chasing that bag from early, that's why these guys are on the money. But anyway, the Declaration of Independence would clap back at the British ops, and Ben Franklin would showcase his impeccable pen game, where he would go bar for bar, detailing just how the King of Great Britain had wronged the American people. Now, after the Brits heard this diss, they would be outraged and the war would escalate. During this time, Philadelphia would also serve as the nation's revolutionary capital, which made it a particularly special target, and the main bloc for the United States to defend. And in 1777, the Brits would stand on business, successfully sliding in Philadelphia and taking over the city. But the occupation wouldn't last that long, as one of Britain's oldest ops, the French, would click up with the American 13 colonies, making the British-occupied New York vulnerable to naval attack by their old rivals, which forced the British to do the dash, getting run off the block and eventually retreating from Philadelphia. Philly would not only be one of the early capitals of America, but also the nation's largest city until 1790, when it was surpassed by New York. But this special time as America's leading city established Philadelphia as an economic and intellectual powerhouse in the country for hundreds of years. It's also the home to many of the alleged firsts in American history, such as having the nation's first library in 1731, the first hospital in 1751, the first central bank in 1781, and the first zoo in 1874. However, in much more recent times, despite the city's central role in America's history, Philadelphia has become somewhat passed in fame by some of the flashier and larger cities in the nation, like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. But still, over the years, the city has had a strong hold on American culture and has been famously depicted in numerous popular movies and TV shows, like providing the backdrop for the ultimate boxing underdog story in the Rocky movie series, which showcase some of Philly's most famous locations, such as the large stairway now called the Rocky Steps going up to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, with this being where the iconic Benjamin Franklin Parkway leading to downtown Philly can be seen in all its glory. Then there's the dark, twisted comedy of the longest-running American live-action sitcom, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, that mostly takes place in the South Philly neighborhood, known for its diverse working-class population. However, both of these popular pieces of media have mostly centered around white characters, but the city also has a very rich African-American history going back decades and even centuries, as the black population in Philly has slowly grown to become the majority. In fact, the first African-Americans arrived in Philadelphia even before the founder of the city, William Penn, as they were brought in as slaves by the first European settlers. Later, even the first president of the newly formed United States, George Washington, would actually keep slaves at his home in Philadelphia. And when one of these, a young woman named Ona Oni Judge, would escape, the president would publish ads in the local papers to try and get her captured and returned. However, Philadelphia has also become home to the first abolition movement in the country, driven by the Quaker movement that the city's founder had also been part of. This movement eventually forming the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Now, the number of African Americans in Philadelphia slowly increased during the 18th and 19th centuries, with many free black residents becoming involved in the abolitionist movement and serving as conductors on the Underground Railroad, a network of people, organizations, secret routes, and safe houses that helped slaves to escape from the antebellum South. Most famously, Harriet Tubman would escape her slavery in Maryland in 1849, finding refuge in Philadelphia, from where she would make over a dozen trips to rescue others still held in slavery. Philadelphia was also home to the Free African Society, founded by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in 1787, the first black religious institution in the city, which led to the creation of the first independent black churches in America. However, like in most other northern cities, Philadelphia's white population would also show great hostility towards the new black inhabitants. And in the early 19th century, Philadelphia went through several major race riots that destroyed black homes, businesses, and abolitionist meeting places, such as the Pennsylvania Hall that was built by the abolitionists only to be burnt down by the white rioters a few days after it opened in 1838. In the the 20th century, the Great Migration drew a wave of black migrants from the southern states to Philadelphia, who were both escaping from the Jim Crow era, attracted by wartime job opportunities during World War I. Because of this, Philly's black population doubled from 63,000 in 1900 to 134,000 in 1920. Most of these new arrivals came from rural areas and were working class, competing for jobs with the white population, many of whom were also recently received migrants. This would lead to yet more racially motivated riots and even a lynching in the nearby town of Coatesville, where a black steelworker named Zachariah Walker was burned alive by a mob after he had allegedly shot and killed a policeman in 1911. This would prompt even President Roosevelt to write an editorial in a newspaper condemning the attack, but nevertheless, everyone indicted for it would eventually be acquitted. Later during the 20th century, the black population of Philly would grow significantly, despite becoming increasingly segregated to poorly upkept neighborhoods that the government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation established as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression. Many of these areas housing black inhabitants being considered hazardous or definitely declining. But despite all the challenges that the black population in Philly were facing, their numbers kept growing significantly throughout the century, peaking at over 650,000 residents in 1970, at the time making up 1/3 of the city's population. Unfortunately, around this time, America would go through a major phase of deindustrialization, and Philly, being part of the so-called Rust Belt region in the northeastern United States, would get hit particularly badly by the decline of industrial working-class jobs. The white population of the city would respond to this by moving to the suburbs in the neighboring counties, while the black population would both lack the resources to do the same, as well as being commonly still subjected to discriminatory housing policies. This essentially locked them into the poor inner cities, where the wages would keep dropping and the poverty kept increasing. As a result of the white flight from the city, the population would decline, while the percentage of the black population from the overall population would grow, with the black population eventually becoming the majority coming into the 2000s. The changing demographics in the latter half of the 20th century would once again cause unrest in the city, leading to events like the 1964 Philadelphia race riot, also known as the Columbia Avenue riot, as tensions between Philly's black population and police department accused of police brutality would boil over, with this taking place during the civil rights era, when similar riots would take place all over America. But perhaps the most shocking event would take place a few decades later, in 1985, when the Philly Police Department, aka PPD, would literally decide to drop a bomb on some of the city's black residents. The PPD had been in an increasingly tense face-off for years with a group called MOVE, founded by a man named John Africa, a black revolutionary whose ideology also combined aspects from the hippie movement, such as environmental protection and animal rights. On the 13th of May 1985, after years of escalating tension between the police and this group that had previously led to a policeman getting killed during an attempt to evict the group from their homes in 1979, the mayor had given an order to evict this group from their new home due to complaints of disturbance. But in a move that seems completely insane by any metric in any city, this would eventually escalate to the PPD actually dropping a satchel bomb off at the house, which would end up blowing up and burning down the entire block, which actually killed 11 people, including John Africa himself and 5 children, as well as destroying 61 homes and leaving 250 people homeless. But despite numerous official investigations into the tragedy, including a mayor-appointed investigative commission whose final report called the bombing reckless, ill-conceived, and hastily approved, in the end, no one would end up being criminally charged. Due to the centuries-long discrimination, segregation, and the resulting poverty of Philly's large, now majority inner-city black population, and the overall decline of the city's economy during the late 20th century, this heightened the crime rates that have troubled inner-city Philly for decades. And moreover, since the city has a rather ideal location near other big East Coast cities like New York, Washington, and Baltimore, as a result, Philadelphia has become quite known for its organized crime, with groups of gangsters swooping in to take advantage of the dire conditions in the city's underworld. From the Italian-American mafia, to the notorious Black Mafia, to the modern-day street gangs that have caused a major gun crime epidemic in the 2020s, these early Philly gangs would establish a criminal underworld of gangs, guns, drugs, and violence that would be passed down from generation to generation, eventually birthing the modern-day gangsters and gangster rappers that make up the Philly drill music scene. So, now you know the socio-economic background that made Philly the tough, hard-headed city that it is today, let's take a closer look at the gangs that operate there and how the world of crime functions in the Philadelphia criminal underworld.